The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Sergeant Maria Santos lay unconscious in the medical bay. Her dark hair was matted with dried blood, and a purple bruise spread across the left side of her face where the boot had connected. The attack had happened during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise, but nothing about yesterday felt routine anymore. Captain James Walker stood beside her bed, his jaw clenched as he read through the incident report for the third time. The words on the paper seemed to burn into his mind. According to witnesses, Santos had been questioning some irregular supply shipments when 3 soldiers from Alpha Company cornered her behind the supply depot. The confrontation had escalated quickly, ending with Private Rodriguez delivering a vicious kick to her head while she was already down. Dr. Emily Chen finished checking Santos's vitals and approached Walker with concern etched on her face. The injury was serious, but not life-threatening, she explained. However, the circumstances surrounding the assault were deeply troubling. Santos had been investigating discrepancies in equipment requisitions, and her questions had apparently struck a nerve with the wrong people. As Walker processed this information, his radio crackled to life. The base commander wanted to see him immediately. Something big was happening, and the urgency in the voice on the other end suggested this incident was about to become much larger than anyone had anticipated. The walk to the command center felt longer than usual. Other soldiers they passed seemed tense, whispering among themselves and casting nervous glances. Word had spread quickly through the base that Santos was in the medical bay, and rumors were already beginning to circulate about what had really happened during the training exercise. Inside the command building, Walker found Lieutenant Colonel Martinez pacing behind his desk, his phone pressed to his ear. The conversation was brief and cryptic, consisting mostly of "yes, sir" and "understood, sir." When he hung up, his expression was grim. The assault on Santos had triggered something unexpected. Her investigation into the supply irregularities had apparently uncovered evidence of a much larger problem. Equipment was going missing, funds were being diverted, and several high-ranking officers might be involved. What started as a simple case of soldiers getting violent had now become a potential scandal that could reach the highest levels of command. Martinez explained that Santos had been documenting everything meticulously. Her notes, which were now secured in his safe, painted a picture of systematic theft and corruption that had been going on for months. The 3 soldiers who attacked her weren't just angry about being questioned, they were protecting something much bigger than themselves. The situation became even more complex when Martinez revealed that Santos had been planning to take her findings to the Inspector General's office the day after the attack. Someone had known about her intentions and decided to stop her before she could file her report. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. As they discussed the implications, Walker began to understand why his commander looked so worried. If Santos was right about the corruption, it meant that people in positions of authority had been stealing from their own unit. Equipment that should have been protecting soldiers was being sold on the black market. Money meant for training and supplies was ending up in private pockets. The corruption investigation was about to become a military priority. But first, they needed to ensure Santos was safe. If someone was willing to have her attacked once, they might try again. Walker was assigned to coordinate her protection while she recovered, but he knew that keeping her safe would be challenging in an environment where they couldn't be sure who to trust. Meanwhile, across the base, the 3 soldiers who had carried out the attack were beginning to panic. Private Rodriguez couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he realized the magnitude of what they had done. They had thought they were just sending a message, but now the entire command structure was paying attention to Santos and her investigation. Staff Sergeant Kelly, who had organized the attack, was frantically trying to contact his handler. The person who had paid them to intimidate Santos was supposed to make this problem go away, but instead it seemed to be getting bigger. The promised protection and support were nowhere to be found, and Kelly was starting to realize they had been used as expendable pawns in someone else's game. The third attacker, Corporal Williams, had barely slept since the incident. He kept replaying the moment when Rodriguez's boot connected with Santos's head and the sickening sound it made. What they had done was wrong, regardless of who had paid them to do it. His conscience was eating away at him, and he was beginning to consider coming forward with the truth. As the day progressed, the tension on the base continued to build. Officers were holding hushed conversations in corners, and enlisted personnel were speculating about what was really happening. The official story was that Santos had been injured during a training accident. But too many people had seen too much for that explanation to hold up for long. In her hospital bed, Santos began to regain consciousness intermittently. During her brief moments of clarity, she tried to communicate with Dr. Chen about her investigation. The medical officer could see the urgency in Santos's eyes, but the sergeant wasn't coherent enough yet to provide clear information about what she had discovered. The corruption network that Santos had uncovered was far more extensive than anyone realized. It involved not just the theft of equipment and money, but also falsified training records, manipulated inspection reports, and compromised safety protocols. Lives had been put at risk to protect illegal profits, and the people responsible were willing to use violence to keep their secrets safe. As evening approached, Walker received another urgent call. This time, the message was different. 3 helicopters had been spotted approaching the base, carrying passengers from higher up the command chain than anyone at the local level had expected. Whatever Santos had discovered was serious enough to bring in investigators from the very top of the military hierarchy. The arrival of these high-ranking officials would change everything. They wouldn't be bound by local loyalties or influenced by personal relationships within the unit. They would have the authority and resources to conduct a thorough investigation, regardless of who might be implicated. For those involved in the corruption, time was running out. The corrupt officers knew that their carefully constructed scheme was about to be exposed. They had underestimated Santos's thoroughness and the reach of her investigation. What they had hoped to stop with intimidation and violence was now beyond their control, and the consequences would be severe for everyone involved. As night fell over the base, Walker maintained his vigil beside Santos's bed. She was the key witness to everything that was about to unfold, and protecting her had become the most important mission of his career. The helicopters would arrive in the morning, bringing with them the power to expose the truth and deliver justice for what had been done to her and to the unit as a whole. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the morning air announced the arrival that everyone on base had been dreading or anticipating, depending on which side of the corruption they found themselves. 3 Black Hawks touched down simultaneously on the parade ground, their precision formation suggesting this was no ordinary inspection visit. General Patricia Hoffman stepped from the lead helicopter, her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Behind her emerged General Robert Chen, a specialist in military criminal investigations, and General Michael Torres, whose reputation for uncovering institutional fraud was legendary throughout the armed forces. The trio moved with purpose across the tarmac, their presence immediately commanding the attention of every soldier in sight. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez waited at attention with his senior staff, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning temperature. He had spent the sleepless night preparing for this moment, knowing that his career and potentially his freedom hung in the balance. The paperwork in his briefcase contained everything they knew about Santos's investigation, but he suspected it would prove to be just the beginning of what the generals would uncover. In the medical bay, Santos had regained enough consciousness to speak coherently for the first time since the attack. Dr. Chen was documenting her statements carefully, knowing they would become crucial evidence in whatever proceedings were about to unfold. Santos's memory of the attack itself was still fuzzy, but her recollection of the investigation that had led to it was crystal clear and deeply damning. She described a systematic pattern of theft that had been operating for at least 8 months. Military vehicles were being reported as damaged beyond repair when they were actually being sold to civilian contractors. Training ammunition was being diverted to black market dealers. Even rations and medical supplies were disappearing from inventory, only to reappear in unauthorized sales channels. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Santos estimated that over $2 million in equipment and supplies had been stolen from their unit alone. If similar operations were running at other bases, the total theft could reach tens of millions. The people responsible had turned military logistics into their personal profit center, betraying their oath and endangering the soldiers who depended on properly maintained equipment. General Hoffman's first stop was the command center, where she immediately ordered all personnel files to be secured and all computer systems to be isolated pending forensic examination. Her team of investigators had arrived on the second helicopter, and they went to work with the efficiency of professionals who had conducted similar operations many times before. The investigation team's methods were thorough and uncompromising. They interviewed every soldier who had been on duty during the supply irregularities, cross-referenced all equipment logs with maintenance records, and began tracking financial transactions involving anyone with access to supply systems. Within hours, patterns began to emerge that confirmed Santos's suspicions and revealed the full extent of the criminal enterprise. Corporal Williams, who had been struggling with guilt since the attack, decided he could no longer remain silent. He approached one of the investigators and requested a private interview. His confession provided the first direct testimony about who had ordered the assault on Santos and why. According to Williams, Staff Sergeant Kelly had been receiving payments from someone higher up the chain of command to ensure that certain supply discrepancies weren't investigated too closely. The revelation that junior enlisted personnel had been hired as enforcers for the corruption network added a new dimension to the investigation. It suggested that the people running the scheme were willing to use violence and intimidation systematically, not just in response to Santos's specific investigation. Other soldiers might have been threatened or attacked for asking inconvenient questions. General Chen took personal charge of interviewing the 3 attackers. His approach was methodical and psychological, designed to break down the barriers of loyalty and fear that were protecting the larger conspiracy. Rodriguez, who had delivered the kick that hospitalized Santos, proved to be the weakest link in their group's resolve. Under intensive questioning, Rodriguez revealed that the payments for intimidating Santos had come through Kelly, but the orders had originated from someone with enough authority to access personnel records and duty assignments. The attackers had been given detailed information about Santos's schedule and planned movements, suggesting that someone in the command structure was actively coordinating the violence. Meanwhile, General Torres was conducting a parallel investigation into the financial aspects of the corruption. His team had identified several bank accounts that received regular deposits coinciding with equipment write-offs and supply shortages. The money trail was becoming clearer, pointing toward a network of military personnel and civilian contractors who had been profiting from the theft. The civilian contractors were a crucial piece of the puzzle. They provided a way for stolen military equipment to be laundered into legitimate-seeming sales. Several companies had been receiving unusually favorable contracts for purchasing supposedly damaged vehicles and surplus equipment. Investigation into these companies revealed that they were owned by relatives and associates of military personnel with supply chain responsibilities. As the investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the corruption had been enabled by systematic failures of oversight and accountability. Inspection reports had been falsified, inventory counts had been manipulated, and financial controls had been deliberately bypassed. The scheme required cooperation from multiple levels of the military hierarchy, suggesting that the conspiracy reached higher than anyone had initially suspected. Captain Walker continued his assignment protecting Santos, but his role had evolved into serving as a liaison between the medical team and the investigators. Santos's condition was improving, but she remained vulnerable to further attacks. The generals had brought their own security team to ensure her safety, recognizing that she was the key witness whose testimony could make or break their case. The atmosphere on the base had become increasingly tense as word of the investigation spread. Soldiers were being called in for individual interviews, and access to many areas was restricted pending security sweeps. Those who were innocent felt nervous about being caught up in the investigation, while those who were guilty were desperately trying to cover their tracks or distance themselves from the conspiracy. Staff Sergeant Kelly attempted to flee the base that afternoon, but was apprehended by military police before he could reach the gate. His panicked attempt to escape only reinforced the investigators' suspicion that he was more deeply involved than he had initially admitted. Under renewed questioning, he began to reveal details about the command structure of the corruption network. The investigation was also uncovering evidence of how the scheme had evolved over time. What had started as small-scale theft of surplus items had gradually grown into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The success of early thefts had emboldened the participants to steal more valuable items and involve more people. The attack on Santos represented a dangerous escalation, showing that the conspirators were willing to use serious violence to protect their operation. By the end of the second day, General Hoffman had identified at least 12 military personnel who appeared to be directly involved in the corruption network. The group included enlisted soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and at least 3 commissioned officers. The breadth of the conspiracy explained how it had been able to operate undetected for so long, and why it had been so difficult for Santos to get anyone to take her concerns seriously. The evidence was building toward a series of criminal charges that would destroy careers and result in lengthy prison sentences. The military justice system would handle the prosecution of uniformed personnel, while federal prosecutors would deal with the civilian contractors who had participated in the scheme. The coordinated law enforcement response would ensure that no one involved escaped accountability for their crimes. As night fell on the second day of the investigation, Santos was finally strong enough to provide a full statement to the generals personally. Her detailed account of what she had discovered and how she had been silenced provided the foundation for everything else the investigators had uncovered. Her courage in pursuing the investigation despite the personal danger had made it possible to expose a conspiracy that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The third day of the investigation brought unexpected revelations that shocked even the experienced generals who had seen corruption in many forms throughout their careers. Computer forensics had uncovered encrypted communications showing that the theft network extended beyond their single base to at least 4 other installations across the region. This was not just local corruption, but an organized criminal enterprise operating within the military itself. Major Patricia Vega, the unit supply officer, had managed to maintain her composure during the first 2 days of questioning, but the digital evidence was irrefutable. Her personal laptop contained detailed records of every fraudulent transaction, complete with photographs of stolen equipment and correspondence with civilian buyers. When confronted with this evidence, she finally admitted her role as the primary coordinator of the entire operation. The confession session lasted for 6 hours, during which Vega revealed the full structure of the conspiracy. She had been recruited 3 years earlier by a network that had already established operations at other bases. The system was sophisticated, with different people handling logistics, finances, and security. The attack on Santos had been ordered by regional coordinators who viewed her investigation as a threat to their entire multi-million-dollar operation. General Torres discovered that the corruption had been funded initially by organized crime groups seeking to acquire military-grade equipment for resale to overseas buyers. What had started as a partnership had evolved into something more complex. with military personnel essentially running their own criminal organization that sometimes cooperated with and sometimes competed with civilian crime syndicates. The investigation revealed that Santos had unknowingly stumbled onto one of the largest military corruption cases in recent history. Her meticulous documentation had provided the missing piece that investigators needed to understand how equipment was being transferred from military inventory to illegal markets. Her courage in continuing the investigation despite threats and intimidation had prevented the theft of millions more dollars in equipment. Captain Walker received new orders to coordinate the protection of other witnesses who were beginning to come forward. The success of the investigation had encouraged several soldiers who had previously remained silent to report suspicious activities they had observed. Some had been afraid to speak up earlier, while others had not realized that what they were seeing was part of a larger criminal scheme. Private Martinez, a supply clerk who had been forced to falsify inventory reports, provided testimony that helped investigators understand how the paperwork manipulation had worked. She had been threatened with false accusations of theft herself if she refused to cooperate with the scheme. Her testimony revealed that several other junior enlisted personnel had been coerced into participation through similar threats and intimidation tactics. The general's investigation also uncovered evidence that the corruption network had been stealing medical supplies that were critical for combat operations. Bulletproof vests, medical equipment, and emergency rations had all been diverted from their intended use. This theft had potentially endangered soldiers' lives in ways that went far beyond financial damage, adding serious additional charges to the cases being built against the conspirators. Dr. Chen was asked to provide medical testimony about Santos's injuries and recovery process. Her professional assessment confirmed that the attack had been intended to cause serious harm, not just intimidation. The force of the kick to Santos's head could have resulted in permanent brain damage or death. This evidence supported charges of attempted murder against Rodriguez and conspiracy charges against those who had ordered the attack. General Hoffman's team had worked around the clock to ensure that all evidence was properly collected and preserved for prosecution. The case would involve both military courts-martial and federal criminal proceedings, requiring careful coordination between different legal systems. The complexity of the prosecution meant that some trials might not begin for several months, but the evidence was strong enough to ensure convictions for most of the participants. The civilian contractors who had been purchasing stolen equipment were arrested by federal agents in coordinated raids across 3 states. Their businesses were shut down and their assets frozen pending legal proceedings. Investigation into their operations revealed that they had been reselling stolen military equipment to buyers in several foreign countries, raising additional national security concerns. Santos was finally discharged from the medical facility on the 4th day, though she would require several more weeks of recovery time. General Chen personally presented her with a commendation for her dedication to duty and courage in exposing the corruption network. Her actions had prevented continued theft and potentially saved lives by ensuring that critical equipment reached the soldiers who needed it. The entire unit underwent restructuring to prevent similar corruption from taking root again. New oversight procedures were implemented, personnel were reassigned to break up existing relationships that might have enabled future fraud, and additional training was provided about recognizing and reporting suspicious activities. The goal was to create a culture where corruption could not flourish undetected. The psychological impact of the investigation on the unit was significant. Soldiers who had trusted their leadership felt betrayed by those who had abused their positions for personal profit. Rebuilding morale and trust would take time and consistent effort from the new command structure. Counseling services were provided for personnel who needed help processing what had happened to their unit. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez retained his command, but with a formal reprimand for failing to detect the corruption that had operated under his authority. His career prospects were permanently damaged, though investigators had concluded that he was incompetent rather than complicit. The distinction mattered for his legal standing, but not for his professional future. The three soldiers who had attacked Santos faced different fates based on their levels of cooperation with the investigation. Rodriguez, who had delivered the potentially fatal kick, was sentenced to 10 years in military prison and received a dishonorable discharge. Williams, whose cooperation had been crucial to solving the case, received a reduced sentence of 3 years. Kelly, who had organized the attack, was sentenced to 8 years and faced additional federal charges for his role in coordinating the broader conspiracy. Major Vega's cooperation with investigators earned her a reduced sentence of 12 years instead of the life imprisonment she could have faced for her leadership role in the conspiracy. However, her military career was over, and she would never again hold a position of trust or authority. Her testimony would be crucial in prosecuting the regional coordinators who had recruited her into the criminal network. The investigation's success led to similar operations at other bases where the corruption network had been active. Over the following months, more than 30 military personnel and 20 civilian contractors were arrested in connection with the expanded investigation. The total value of recovered and prevented thefts exceeded $50 million, making it one of the largest military corruption cases ever prosecuted. Santos received a promotion to staff sergeant and was transferred to a new assignment where her investigative skills would be put to better use. Her experience had demonstrated the importance of having dedicated personnel who were trained to recognize and investigate fraud and corruption. The military began developing new programs to identify and train soldiers who showed aptitude for this type of work. General Hoffman submitted a comprehensive report to the Pentagon recommending systemic changes to prevent similar corruption networks from developing in the future. Her recommendations included enhanced financial oversight, improved inventory tracking systems, and better training for personnel responsible for supply chain management. Implementation of these changes began immediately at bases across the military. The case also highlighted the importance of protecting whistleblowers who reported suspected wrongdoing. New policies were implemented to ensure that personnel who reported corruption would be protected from retaliation and that their concerns would be investigated promptly and thoroughly. Santos's experience had shown how dangerous it could be for someone to investigate corruption without proper support and protection. Captain Walker was promoted to major and assigned to head a new program designed to investigate corruption and fraud across multiple military installations. His experience protecting Santos and coordinating with the investigating generals had given him valuable insights into how such investigations should be conducted. His new role would help ensure that future corruption networks would be detected and dismantled more quickly. The success of the investigation sent a clear message throughout the military that corruption would not be tolerated and that those who engaged in it would face severe consequences. The comprehensive nature of the prosecution and the heavy sentences imposed served as a deterrent to others who might be tempted to abuse their positions for personal gain. The case became a model for how similar investigations should be conducted in the future.